Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Seth Hart and Dr. Matthew Meinard. Seth, you're on your way to getting a PhD, so soon I'll call you Dr. Hart or Dr. Seth or whatever. Um, so since I've already had Dr. Meinard on before, Seth, could I have you go first and just introducing yourself?
Yeah, like you said, I'm Seth Hart. I'm doing a PhD at Durham University. My focus is in science and religion, science and theology, focusing specifically on biological teleology and the sort of theistic implications that go along with that.
Yeah, and Seth, I don't think I ever told you this, but before I got into like a lot of the study of scripture and philosophy, I wanted to be an evolutionary biologist. So
Hmm.
all the stuff you're talking about, like I absolutely adore it. So that's awesome. Dr. Meinard, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. It's good to be back, son.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind if I call you Matthew just for
Oh,
the
that's
sake of
fine.
brevity?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
that's fine. I mean, this is like an online thing. People are always insisting on Dr. Meinard, but it's okay. That's for hierarchy over my students. That's, I maintain it there. So
Right. Yeah, I feel weird like not obeying hierarchy. But anyway, so let me just start off with you, Dr. Meinard. There we go. Could you just define for us teleology?
yeah, and I'll just do this pretty broadly, and then I'll pass it off to Seth.
Mm-hmm.
But broadly speaking, the notion of teleology in the world of natural philosophy and metaphysics and classical philosophy, at least, is the idea that all agency takes place in the context of some kind of end, some kind of for the sake of which. The maxim that usually this is summarized in from the Aristotelian tradition and then is taken up in the scholastics in the West is that every agent acts for an end. But a kind of broader way of defining it would be if I just can just jump into jargon a little bit, but every case of efficient causality has an internal structuring principle, which would be the end for the sake of which maybe we'd say for the sake of which or against the backdrop of which we understand that agency. And so this applies all the way in the classical view, at least philosophically, all the way from the lowest level of agency, all the way up the sort of metaphysical, the great chain of being.
Mm-hmm.
That all agents, all agency, all efficiency, all efficient causality is operative in view of some end. So just sort of broadly speaking it, and then we'll eventually deal with questions of history and whatnot. So kick it off to Seth, who operates in the native territory of teleology, I think, because it's biology and the philosophy of biology is where so much of this is born, I think, in Aristotle's mind. So why don't you go ahead, Seth? I'm sure you'll flesh that out.
Yeah, and working within the biological terrain, the only thing that was an absolutely great introduction. The only thing I would add is that within biology, there's often a way of mishearing the term teleology and equating it with design. You even see that with some people who study the subject, is they equate the word teleology with design. But as your definition, Matthew, just really points out, is nothing within what you said purports to have a sort of extrinsic architect, coming in and molding a sort of passive matter into instilling a purpose from some sort of an exterior point of view, and putting that on some sort of thing. So within biology, when we talk about biological teleology, when you actually get into the literature of it, quite often it's exactly what you talk about. It's how can we use purposive language? How can we talk about things like what is a wing for? Well, it's for flying.
Mm-hmm.
How can we use that sort of language in a way that seems to imply a purpose and orientation towards an end, in a way that makes sense, that philosophers of biology are going to be satisfied with? So that's the only nuance, is whenever we talk about teleology, we're not talking about design, though design is obviously one very specific instance of teleology.
Right. So we're not talking about like Paley's watch and as if biological organisms are like machines made and jam-packed together by the designer, right? That's not necessarily what we're talking about. Something more nuanced and subtle. So Seth, let me go to you now and ask just, you talked about like the hesitation and even the misunderstanding that exists in some of the literature on teleology. Could you just describe for us, historically speaking, what happened with teleology, especially the Aristotelian notion?
Yeah. So as Matthew really pointed out, the classical notion of teleology, it became the sort of predominant standard. There were obviously a minority report of atomists who sort of denied a natural teleology throughout history. But by and large, the Aristotelian idea of teleology reigned from his rediscovery in the 13th century, all the way through into the beginning of modernity. That's what you see in Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas. And then you had a few transitional figures. William of Ockham's name is often thrown out as a transitional figure, though there's debate on that. But really where you begin to see a sort of skepticism regarding natural teleology comes with the rise of voluntarism, comes with figures like Sir Francis Bacon and René Descartes, the sort of founders of modernity, who really shifted science towards a focus on efficient causality, but it's efficient causality that's divorced from its sort of intrinsic link to final causality. As Matthew pointed out, there was this, you understood efficient and final causality sort of with respect to one another, but efficient causality became more and more about a transference of force rather than a giving of form. And that's something that you see early modernity really start to bring up. And this is a complete shift in how we understand causation itself. But I will say, where final causality, with the birth of modern science, it sort of went into decline. I will say that the one exception to that was in British biology. The British natural theologians sort of resisted this. And that's because of a few early figures like William Harvey, who was an Aristotelian and showed the heuristic value. So for instance, he would explain a heart for the purpose of pumping blood and use that and show that why it's heuristically valuable to assume that if a heart is for the purpose of pumping blood, we can make sort of predictions from that. And then you have figures like Robert Boyle, and of course you brought up William Paley. But what's interesting though is originally we had an Aristotelian teleology, which saw teleology, the word's often used as intrinsic. By the very nature of what something is, we can determine what its purpose is. A bird's wings are for flying because that's just what a bird is. When you understand the form of a bird, what it means to be a bird, you understand that they're flying creatures. These wings have that sort of that telos, that end goal. Well, with Paley, of course, it began to be seen more as an extrinsically imposed artifact, that design. And this is why biology has struggled with it ever since, is when it hears the words teleology, it often thinks about, it equates it with the word design. It's because of this Palean hangover, essentially, that Darwin was reacting against. So that's a brief history leading up to Darwin.
Also, Seth, really quick before we go to Matthew, this idea of just emphasizing efficient causality without really much reference to final causality. Could you give an example of how that was attempted? Because at least for me, right, it's very difficult to imagine efficient causality without final causality. So, I mean, how would they try and cash that out or emphasize basically just only needing efficient causality to make sense of things?
Yeah, so originally there was a theological motive of when you're operating within a sort of voluntaristic, nominalistic framework, you don't see forms as something that the mind can apprehend. It's something that it exists within God and in His command. Things final causes. It exists extrinsic to the thing itself, right? So the problem is, and you read Descartes in a few places, he talks about this, is to presuppose that we can go into the mind of God and know something's final cause. When you're not operating from an Aristotelian framework where you can abstract the form from the thing, when you can see, whenever the form is the intellect is capable of grasping the form of things, a thing's final cause exists within the mind of God. You seem to sort of be transgressing into the divine. You seem to sort of presuming that you can get into the mind of God in a way that Descartes felt uncomfortable with. So, but of course, he was operating on a different sort of theological framework than, say, Thomas Aquinas was. So that began to his emphasis on efficient causality. Efficient causality, we can see when I pick up this cup, I can understand that it's me picking, that we see the causal error going from me to the cup. But then, to go beyond that would be to be going into territory that a lot of these early modern thinkers weren't comfortable going with. And there's a lot of, I could go on to this for a while because there was a shift in what was understood by matter. Matter began to have more of a positive ontology, began to be seen as a passive thing that only was acted upon by force. So this impetus. So we see this especially in Galileo, bringing up John Philoponus' stuff, is this idea that matter wasn't sort of that matter didn't necessarily need a form. Matter itself could just sort of exist. It was understood as a sort of positive ontology on its own. And once you understood matter as just a sort of passive stuff, then you need a sort of to explain motion. You don't need to appeal to a final cause. You can explain it by an exterior force being applied to it, and then you can measure that at mathematically. And unfortunately, places like Oxford, with the Oxford calculators, were some of the major places where this form of thinking really took off. So that's an unfortunate legacy from my alma mater. But anyway.
All right, Dr. Miner, do you want to add anything to that?
It's mostly like keying in to bits. I mean, basically, it's fundamental agreement. But if you see me, I mean, I'm an exhausted father. Although you're an exhausted Midwesterner, Seth. But if I look like I'm displeased, I'm not at all. I'm just writing down on the back of an envelope because that was the first piece of paper I could find, a couple notes. So you hit actually the thing that first came to my mind, which is where I thought you were going to go. So let me answer more of a question that you raised there, Sue, and about how can you even conceptualize beneficent causality that's exercised without finality? It's in part, it's very comfortable within a voluntaristic framework for the reason you said, especially with an external teleology that's going to have to only be really conceptualizable in God who put the causality in there. Although from what I recall, there's some place that Descartes punts in the Principles of Nature where he refers to internal causality, but I've always been kind of internal or intrinsic final causality, but I'm not quite sure how that works out in his ontology of matter. But setting that aside, the other thing is, and it's exactly where you went at the end of there, Seth, is that the rise of the physico-mathematical sciences and then the continued dominance of them, as physics, classical mechanics becomes the kind of the lodestar of what science is. The causal scheme also is effectively, the view of what, I mean, not merely science is, but what of, the ontology of reality is. The matter in motion, if you're just concerned with quantitative schematizing of the obedience, if you will, of matter to certain laws that can be experimentally verified. It's the stand-in for teleology. Would you agree with this, Seth? Is the discovered laws of physics. There's a sense, it's the intelligibility is that, like Monsignor Sokolowski once said whenever I was in graduate school, he said, the problem is that, too often modern physicists think that the equations are a cause, like an Aristotelian. And I think that what he was seeing when he said that was that the, sort of, if you just think about classical mechanics, all of your Newtonian style physics equations, there's a kind of intelligible structure there. And that's the intelligible structure of the efficiency, but you're immediately lifted back away from teleology precisely because of the quantification of the motion. I mean, I tend to talk always within this worldview because I'm not perhaps as ecumenical as you are, Seth, where I just live as an Aristotelian because it's my vocation as a translator and the teaching in seminaries that I do, right? So I don't do as much ad extra stuff. But I say it's the vengeance of the fact that there are no final causes in the quantitative sphere. This is sort of one of these things in Aristotle. It's like a maxim just thrown out. But a way to see this is that if you're doing pure mathematics in particular, you're very much concerned with the lines of connection between properties and forms. Like as you do, just geometry is a very easy place to see this as you work out the dependence of properties of given figures, like when you're a kid in middle school doing your proofs. All you're doing is a kind of per se attribution of properties concerning with the quantity in question. That's it, working at the formal causal level of the quantity, and that's it. So there's not a teleology there, but because the equations come in with observation functioning as kind of the input point of trying to verify, that kind of fills in a kind of covert teleology that you just don't admit. Another thing that's just to maybe push it into the history that you said, which was already present with kind of Galileanism, that is the rebirth of atomism helps all of this as well, because atomism is going to tend toward an anti-teleologism. If you take a text that's, it's like sort of the easy text you give your students, something like the De Natura Rerum, on the nature of things by Lucretius, right? You've got a built-in teleology of atoms that are falling and some of which swerve, but you don't talk about it. You just have matter in motion. And so some form of mitigated atomism functions very heavily in a quantified ontology, like what you have by Descartes is just a great example. It's like Descartes may be brilliant for other reasons, but as a philosopher, he's a bit of a scribbler, except insofar as he codifies what's really in the air. And so the idea of an ontology that's just extension, it's a great place to have no teleology, because all you have is a kind of weird embodied mathematicized ontology. And then atomism fills in the details for that. And then just one little thing to make sure that we're level setting for some of our future discussions and the other questions today. we've tended to talk heretofore about kind of intrinsic teleology as being understood as applying to at substance level, or maybe at least part of substance level. So the examples like you took from Harvey of the heart. I would just add too, though, that it's very normal for a medieval and just for a scholastic to say this same scheme, since it applies to all agency, is going to apply to powers of the soul, etc. And it's going to apply more broadly too within the moral and artistic domains, but that's not really as much our issue today. We're more kind of talking on the level of kind of the mind independent metaphysics, of physical reality and ens naturae today. But all right. So anyway, but I wanted to get the powers of the soul thing in there because we may get there, and you already kind of were there even by talking about parts in that way, even though because they're like parts of a substance. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I agree. I just that the mathematical physics helped also get rid of this, and then when it became the lodestar for every other science, right? The hopes of reducing everything to physical laws was just a kind of hope to rip teleology out of everything. So anyway, I'm tired and I'm gonna ramble. You're probably tired too, though. You're very tired too, Seth. So it's like, who am I to complain? So go ahead.
No, that's really good. And I love that you brought up laws of nature, because they're often seen as a sort of mediating position between the modern predicament where teleology is sort of evacuated from nature and the classical medieval position where the laws were seen as intrinsic to the very natures of things themselves, right? Mm-hmm. As opposed to an extrinsic law, and this is what I love about with people like Nancy Cartwright, when she talks about, she's famous for her discussions on whether or not there even are laws of nature. And she, one famous line, she says, science has never gotten away from at least quasi-Aristotelian explanations of things. And what she means by that is there's still a sort of a teleology inbuilt into the idea of laws of nature, at least as they originally formulated, as a sort of extrinsically imposed teleological mechanism whereby God could ensure the sort of orderly functioning of the universe towards some end that God had within his own mind. But that, of course, evacuated the things themselves of their own sort of intrinsic teleology. But that's everything you were sort of hitting on. So anyway, I just wanted to pick up on that point. I thought that was real interesting.
Could I ask you, I'm going to ask you to comment on this, though, because I think that since you're so dealing with the contemporary stuff, maybe you should articulate for the listeners the way that the grim position of a world that is anti-teleological. Because I remember reading once in Atlantic, it was like reading pure Heracliteanism is what it was like. This kind of pragmatic view about truth, and the way that, really there are no essential structures to anything, which is another way of saying there's no essential kind of nucleus for the end complex for agency. And maybe you can just describe what that kind of absolute flux no teleology looks like for the listeners, because I think it's useful for people to see the grimness of running this all the way to its end, because we almost always tend to talk about it in the mitigated form, even when we're combating non-teleologism.
Yeah, so there's so much that I could say on that, because I think it's sort of the reason I focus on it is I think it is the sort of crux issue, or at least one of the major crux issues of modern philosophy and theology. Within my own field of biology, the big question is if we evacuate the world of any real teleology, a teleological realism, is there such thing as biology? Which are biologists always sort of just, working toward the elimination of their own field and reducing creatures towards just a chemistry, which will be reduced to physics, which will be reduced to whatever is most fundamental, atoms, fundamental particles in motion. That's all you are. So you get to nearly a Mariological nihilism, which is there are no composite objects because there are no holes. Yeah, there are no holes, right? That I don't exist as a sort of ontological unit, which is just, an awful place to be in. I think that's obviously a big thing. I think that's a pretty big, way of conceiving the world. If you don't think that human beings exist except as a sort of abstract, creation of the human mind, right? But then you get into a whole thing about the human mind's ability to abstract and stuff like that. Does that presuppose a teleology? Of course. So it nearly ends up into points of absurdity, trying to take this into its ultimate conclusions. I think you can speak on this a lot more than I can, but Alistair McIntyre, ever since him, we talk about the sort of moral dilemma that a lack of teleology has done. So not only on a sort of physical science side, there's also the moral side, which I know we'll get into.
How about we just jump into just the ethics really quick, since we brought it up, and then we'll get back to other things. But Dr. Meinert, could I have you just talk about the ethical ramifications of, dispelling teleology?
Yeah, they're probably, let's just say there are two big levels, right? So let's set aside the problem first of the more complex one of physical natural teleology and morality, which we do need to address because that's kind of going to be this root issue of, kind of the basis of the natural law as the category that goes into, like how to handle that. But if you don't have some conception of teleology, you're actually not going to even be able to articulate what free agency looks like, which is going to almost immediately evacuate the possibility of a grammar of imputability for actions, let alone for the categorization of actions. So let's, I'm a man who thinks in terms of a kind of broadly Aristotelian, Thomist virtue ethic. And so if you can't consider, that for the sake of which this act was performed, which would be, nothing more than, what's the intrinsic structure and character of this chosen and commanded act, you can't actually come up with moral objects. But even deeper than that, if you don't have some form of teleology, I would argue very, very easily, you can't explain even the idea of the choice of means against ends, because you can't talk about ends if you really want to take out teleology as a universal principle. Now, or you could end up in a dualism where you've got free agents and you kind of have a determined world. So we're kind of, I guess, edging to the other side here. So there's one problem of you could end up with, you really have no teleology. You're in an absolute relativism, not mitigated relativism. I mean, it's a full relativism that then you have to figure out how to nominalistically name what's right and wrong, but it's going to become a kind of conventionalism or something. But then if you start asking, well, okay, how do I relate this experience of end-directed activity to the world? You could end up like Kant. So if you guys remember at the end of I think it's at the end of the groundwork, the metaphysics of morals, he lays out just starkly the idea of you have to imagine yourself as being in this sort of self-determining realm, right? It's the dualism of modernity is just placed right out there in front. So it's like you imagine yourself as free, but of course we know that physically you're determined in this sort of determined Newtonian world. But in order to have a moral framework and to even keep this discussion of morality off the ground, we have to at least imagine what it's like to be in a pure, basically for him, noumenal world is what that's like. So then the question arises from a more classical perspective: how is it that the pre-givenness of the human person, right? I want to avoid a kind of naturalism here, but the pre-given character of being a human in the world is already filled with moral meanings whenever the human agent considers the possibilities of human action in the world as human. So, let's just choose, for example, something that's actually, even in the controversial realm, what is the meaning of human dignity in dying, right? There's a human way to die. And actually, this is where the questions of transhumanism are a kind of denial of the possibility of what it is to be human and in a positive and flourishing way, even at the most, tragic of moments. But this is, something applicable across the board, from questions of rights as regards the community that I'm born into, let alone the, of course, always controversial sexual issues, et cetera. How is it that the fact that there's something about me qua human that I can know and that I can at least consider in some general way spills over ethically then into the grasping of moral truths? Now, there are various debates here, and as you both know, you can't walk into a room of Thomists without basically seeing that none of them agree about how we go from natural teleology to moral teleology. And this frustrates everyone on the outside because they say, none of you people agree on anything. But ultimately, your moral insight has to is derivative on some level of just experiencing what it is to be a human in the world and what is it that would be the highest capacities of the human person, right? So if you stay on that kind of general level, and if you pull out teleology from there, you end up having to, at best, go back to a kind of Kantian position, right? Universal rational norms that can be applied to everyone, or something like that, is going to have to stand in otherwise, instead of asking what sort of age, who am I, considering myself in the world, both by way of nature and by way of grace. And then in light of that, what does that mean for then the actions that are befitting of me to choose? And so, there is a real need to ground in some way, even if we leave it general so the Thomists can squabble with each other, your moral teleology, the internal structuring of free acts, upon the pre-givenness of who you are. Because otherwise, if you don't, all you have left is the domain of morals as being the domain of reality, and you're kind of living in the jargon, you're living in the intentional world only. You don't sort of see the grounding of the intentional in the pre-volitional, the precognitional. So
let me hop in, Dr. Minor, and just ask, suppose somebody says, well, it sounds like your answer just said we boiled down to Kantianism, right? And maybe someone's a Kantian and they're like, oh, that's great. Like, let's go. Like, what's the problem with that?
Oh, yeah. You mean in morals like that?
Yeah.
Well, first, I mean, first of all, you eventually have to have the Fichtean moment where you realize that there's no connection to whatever it is that you refer to as the physical world, right? And so you're going to say that the real reality, you have to make a choice, right? At a certain point, well, the real reality is the free human subject, right? That's what I mean. Let's say you go in that direction, you want to maintain freedom, and I think the bent of Kant is that. And I feel that Fichte just took the gamble and was like, yeah, and that eventually in that idealism, it's just the self kind of constitutes a world around itself. And I mean, I think that the march towards something like the great German idealists is the only then at least honest solution there, even if it rhymes with it. Because, otherwise, I guess, you have to be happy to live in a kind of dualism, which is always the mark of a philosophy that hasn't quite answered something. I mean, you're no better than, I have a lot of respect in many ways actually for Leibniz, but it's a universal harmony between the material and the spiritual in the minds, and that's it. And they happen to be blessedly on the same clock. But Leibniz was able to say that because he was a theist and he was a little bit more hopeful. I think that if you make that choice today, you might as well just jump down a Nietzschean hole and just sort of look at the self-assertion of the great self as being, the fulfillment of what that outlook looks like. But that's like quick reasoning, right? Like in order to argue a reductio like that, you got to be close to someone. So I'm proposing that as the view I would take over a couple of beers with my brother-in-law, even if I wouldn't convince him. So
yeah, and I think I want to return later to the question of how do we get from natural teleology to moral teleology, but we'll save that because I want to go back to Seth. Sure. And now just bring up biology.
Yep.
And maybe you can also mix in there in your answer, Seth, just why be a teleological realist as opposed to a nominalist or what have you. So I'll let you go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, well, I've already hinted a little bit at that, which is that I'm a biological realist, which is I do believe that there are such things as biological entities. I think this is sort of fundamental phenomenological way that we relate to the world. So I think that's a big issue. There's been plenty of other topics that I don't touch on, such as the hard problem of consciousness. People who take some sort of real position that the mind is non-reductive to the material constituency. That in itself nearly commits you to a teleological realism. If you take the fact that that when I do something like drink from this cup of coffee, that I do it with an intention, with a purpose or an end goal involved. Where I really focus in on, though, is actually on the theory of evolution itself, which I really want to, show my cards and say, this is what's on the line. And this is really, it sort of sparks attention, especially from my sort of atheistic interlocutors, that the theory of evolution itself is on the line here. And where I sort of hone in on is specific topics, but mostly I deal with the idea of natural selection. And then natural selection, in natural selection, there is this idea, that it's kind of grounded on three different pillars that support it. One is variation. Obviously, you need variation between species. Another one is heritability. You need to be able to pass on those traits. And the last one is fitness differentiation. When they pass it on, some traits will get passed on at a greater rate than others because there's higher degree of fitness within that. Well, when you actually delve into the literature of what does it mean for a creature to be fit, it's an absolute, it's just an absolute confused state that philosophers, biologists don't even know what it means. Quite a few of them have just declared it to be a primitive. They don't know what it means. It's undefinable. We just sort of intuitively get it, right? Which, to me, that's always the philosophical equivalent of waving a white flag at the problem. But some of the ways they've dealt with it is to try to deal with it as propensity. That hasn't worked out. Others, like actually a good friend of mine, Dennis Walsh, we were talking about this with him recently. He says that there is no causal theory of natural selection. Natural selection should just be seen as the expectations of the expectations of the scientists, of the biologists, on how they think the evolutionary trajectory will go. He doesn't think that it's actually, we should view it as a causal mechanism anymore, because we don't have that third pillar well defined in a way that can differentiate it from other mechanisms like migration, mutation, and especially genetic drift. Genetic drift is a sort of randomness that happens within biology for people who don't know what that is. And because of that, of course, that's called the statisticalist interpretation, that natural selection is just about the statistics, how population geneticists, predict things will happen. Because of that, that's created a huge consternation within the field of biology. And it's been one of the more lively topics as of late. Well, where I delve into it is I actually want to get back to that idea that fitness is a primitive, like what is being assumed within that. And I think what's being assumed within that is, like, as I pointed out earlier, is I think we are all children of British natural theological tradition, that we've inherited this idea through obviously many generations, many centuries removed from Aristotle, but we've inherited an Aristotelian style biology where we think of things being fit, that they have a form that defines the creature as what it is. Those forms have certain powers, and the exercise of those powers within a certain environmental parameters, the greater exercise of those powers increases one's potentiality for survival and reproduction. And that's what we mean when we say something is fit. But things that don't align with a creature's form, that don't increase it or go outside the sort of environmental parameters, those are usually equated with some other forces within biological evolution, such as genetic drift, for instance. So for instance, just to give a quick example, suppose a lion is struck by lightning. A perfectly fit lion is struck by lightning and killed for not for no other reason than it was just absolute random chance. Well, biologists would say, well, we don't give that creature a lower fitness. Well, why not? Well, because it was random chance. Well, what do we mean by that? What they mean by that is none of the exercise of its powers, the things proper to being a lion in comparison to other lions, caused it to die. So we're comparing it to what we think a lion ought to do. And when it doesn't do that, or whenever it dies, it doesn't leave reproduction. We don't say that's a lower fitness. We say, no, that's chance. We don't want to write that off to lower fitness. But then let's say that lion actually is less strong, or it can't hunt prey as well. Well, that's part of what it means to be a lion. So even though the effect is the same, what we say that they actually are caused by different things. One is caused by lower fitness, one is caused by genetic drift. And trying to parse that out in a sort of non-Aristotelian way, a non-Thomistic way, has just bedeviled biology ever since. So I really want to put the feet to the fire of the philosopher's biology and say biological evolution, the theory of biological evolution, which is natural selection, just presupposes this fact that there are Aristotelian essences.
All right, Seth, let me lob an objection to you, right?
Sure.
So, okay, let's say that, okay, it sounds like we need Aristotelian teleology to at least ground natural selection and the idea of an organism being fit.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, for instance, with the thesis of common ancestry, it seems as if there really aren't essences, or everything is maybe on some fundamental level just interchangeable, right? So some people have talked about, well, if you could get, let's say, and this is kind of like maybe the facetious form of it, but it's like, oh, if you get a non-dog from a dog, then what does it really mean to be a dog, right?
Yeah.
Like if you have this type of common descent, then how do you actually sustain real essentialism?
Right. But to even, and what I usually point out is, first off, yes, there are these gray areas. And then how do you change forms, right? That is a very live issue. And there's actually multiple solutions that are possible to that. The problem is not that there's no solution. There's actually multiple solutions. It's debating which one actually works, right? The second one is, what do you mean by dog? And what do you mean by non-dog, right? To even say that species change, and, following Ernst Mayr, a lot, if not most biologists are species realists. They do believe there's such thing as a real species. And the current definition of species is the possibility of interbreeding, which only makes sense for sexually reproducing creatures, but the vast majority of species on Earth are asexual, bacteria and stuff like that. So they don't have a definition of species, but biologists for virtually all agree that even though they don't have a definition of what a species is, well, of course there is real species. So I mean, going with the biology, going with our best theories of biology right now, which is species realism, if we're going to talk about a change from a dog to a non-dog, even if we don't have the mechanism for understanding why that happened, which I don't think we do, the very fact that there are species and species do change, that very language itself presupposes that there is an essence to what it is to be a dog, that somehow its descendants have later lost.
Yeah, Dr. Miner, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you kind of, other than, let me just back up a tiny bit in my mind, because I didn't expect to jump that quickly to me, because I was thinking like, it is built into the language precisely because as soon as you make a per se distinction, you immediately have an essence, right? As soon as you're looking for, even if you're looking for it merely on the level of kind of phenomenal definitions, right? Because there's a lot of the defining that goes on, in the sciences, even defining things along lines of breeding, right? That's you're doing a kind of, I don't want to call it merely accidental definition, because that makes it sound like it's not a definition. It's just the nature of the defining in that particular discipline. It's just as the sciences broke off, their method is along those lines. And even if you don't have the means, as you said, for being able to quite draw the lines, like the method itself reveals the background. It's like this background natural philosophy and metaphysics that can't be articulated on scientific terms, actually. So there we go. Sorry, I was thinking, I'm like, where's the way I can kind of talk about this more on just the purely philosophical level. Behind the practice here, the presupposed species is a natural philosophy and metaphysic, which is not on the same level of abstraction as even natural philosophy, right? I don't know, is it Meyerson or whomever? Maritain loved to cite him, but there's this broad idea as you started to have reactions to scientism and positivism, even outside of the sort of scholastic-y Catholic world at the turn of the 20th century, that says that like scientific methodology itself has built in with itself a kind of metaphysic, even if it doesn't admit it. What's important is to see that it literally can't, by its own principles, begin to discuss it. This is why I think, and this is more into the esoteric of Thomistic thought, but this is why I think it's important to distinguish even within what some call the first degree of abstraction. So the abstract, not metaphysics, but you're considering at least motion and the reality of motion and mobile being, at least abstracting from the particularities of individuals, but not from the conditions of materiality as such, mobile being. That there's, on the one hand, natural philosophy, which considers kind of like the physics of Aristotle, what are the basic principles of motion and change. And then you have all the various, sciences, wherever they happen to subdivide off of biology, let alone the physics and the things that are mediate sciences, that are physico-mathematical. And so behind, in that first degree of abstraction, behind these more phenomenal, it's the word I'm looking for, but phenomenalistic, positivistic in a sense, but they're not purely positivistic, but more phenomena derived sciences, even at observational biology, you have the presupposition of a set of principles which can only be critiqued by, in a sense, going through the data you're looking at. So you have to be honest to the data. Looking at the way I do my science here, I can now add data to my natural philosophy to show that there still is a set of principles. There's still a set of principles here that looks, I think, personally, quite a bit like what one finds in the basic principles of nature, even in those first couple books of the physics, operative. And I can't do the application of even like the logic of this in my methodology without that presupposed background. And it's important just to see that it's a different abstractive move, though, right? You kind of set aside some more of the particularities because you try to get right into the nature of those basic ontological principles of motion that are presupposed. And then the deeper metaphysical bit is to really jump in and say, okay, there's something about species here, and it raises a very important question, especially when it's evolutionary biology, of okay, now what does this mean, however, for me to talk about, kind of the Thomistic account of causality, because I have to have a way of then articulating the mutation of species a little bit better than classical Thomism often does. Although I like to remind people who get cranky about this, that the first issue, I think, or at least the first year of the Revue Thomiste, had a series of articles by Ambrose Gardet, defending the possibility of the metaphysics of evolution in Thomism. So when the cranks come out against it, I like to remind them that even the conservatives in France were comfortable with this. Mm-hmm. So I know I jumped a bit there, but I'm just trying to make the point that it's like there's this background natural philosophy, and then also too, the data of the science starts to raise questions, though, that remind you that, yeah, I need to, however, articulate better my metaphysics, so my metaphysic doesn't kind of imperialistically press down a staticness on the clear data of my scientific venture. But I think that it's the suppleness of Aristotelianism to be able to then expand itself a little bit along those lines. And once again, though, Seth, your bit about nominalism comes back to bite you, though. I mean, or bite the world, I should say, because your only other option is pure nominalism here. Is a kind of pure nominalism. So. But,
yeah, let me make a comment and then ask Seth a question. Although Seth, you were about to say something.
Yeah. One of the things I just want to say to you, Suan. So I'm still wrestling with how I think species change happen.
Yeah.
Someone you can look at his lectures at Oxford, Alex Pruss. He and I discussed this. He has his own idea, a theistic solution to how species change. He actually sees that's a reconciliation between creation and evolution is the basically instilling of matter with new forms but using these secondary causal agents in the act. I'm not convinced. I'm not unconvinced. But anyway, so I wanted to make sure to leave your listeners with someone to go to in case they're curious on that. And he was fresh on my mind.
Yeah. Well, that kind of gets to my question, but let me do my comment first. I mean, so back in the day when I was reading Richard Dawkins and other people, I remember and I mean, I thought he made a good point here. And I think it's The Greatest Show on Earth, the evidence for evolution. He talks about the dead hand of Plato. And I think a lot of people believe that, if you do have essence or form, it has to be fixed and unchanging. So for example, people would more naturally prefer, let's say, a bush of life rather than a tree of life from a single stump or a trunk. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Seth, but I wanted to ask you just to also lay out, what are the potential solutions that are on offer? So you don't have to defend one, but just what have people said, or at least could you direct us to people like Alex Pruss and others who have talked about this issue?
Yeah, maybe Matthew knows a few others that I don't, because this is actually in the midst of what I'm studying now. Another one that is Thomas, and this is the one I'm exploring right now. Thomas lays out a sort of hierarchy of goods between a good for the individual, the species, the greater world, and a good of the principle to the principled, which is good in my relationship to God, as as my form reflects the immanently what God is, or reflects what God is in his goodness itself. And so there's these hierarchy of goods. And so in Aristotle had this interesting thing. If he wasn't quite sure of how to explain reproduction, and again, I think Matthew could also expand upon this as well. So how Aristotle thought reproduction worked was it wasn't because quite often, I expend enormous amounts of resources. If I had a kid, I would expend enormous amounts of resources to ensure the survival of my child, even sacrificing my own life, which works against every other sort of teleological mechanism working within me, which says, survive. Even when I talked about fitness, it's survival and reproduction, these sort of awkward pairs together because they quite often clash. And so how did Aristotle get around to making sense of why organisms are so driven to reproduce? Well, he thought that organisms reproduce because it reflects the eternality of the prime mover. That in the act of reproduction, the species itself, the organisms themselves, through this line, reflects the eternality of God by themselves, in a sense, being eternal through this reproductive act, by this passing on of the form to another creature. And so there you actually see a higher order good, right? You see a higher order good that sort of transcends the individual organism's own good. And so Aquinas works this out, right? He works this out into different tiers, layers of goodness. So if you change the environmental parameter, let's add evolution in now. If you change the environmental parameter, the parameters by which powers what can be good within those sort of environmental parameters will shift as well. So for instance, in a world without water, swimming is not going to be a power that's going to be good for the survival and reproduction of the creature itself. So you have these shifting niches by which organisms can occupy, right? And so for the sake of some sort of higher order good, creatures can then sort of sacrifice these essential powers, these essential things that they have in order to occupy new niches, and thus, in essence, have a transformation so that they can thus occupy these niches and thus embody a form of good not previously occupied. But it's for these higher order goods. If we only think about goods on the level of essence, the individual creaturely essence, we actually miss what Aristotle and Thomas even more explicitly say. There's different levels of goodness. And what Dawkins is talking about is when we have to think of essences as static, because they define what the creature is, and that's what the good of the creature is. But there are other forms of good in both Aristotle and Thomas. And I think once you add that in, you can begin to make sense of a metaphysical picture by which transformation can occur, because you can sacrifice these sort of lower order goods, the good of my individual essence or the good of my species, for a higher order good. So anyway, that's the brief version. Yeah.
Dr. Meinert, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. Did I hear you make a request for texts as well?
Yeah, texts are just, authors who.
Yeah, why don't we let Seth? I'm gonna let Seth do that first.
Oh, sure.
Just because his head is down in this literature. So let me let you do that, and then I'll just add.
What specific text are you thinking?
Yeah, on the issue of like species and essence.
Oh goodness, off the top of my head. Well, check out the Proust lectures, the natural theology lectures that he had in 2019. That's going to be a good one. You might have to remind me, Matthew, is it in Aristotle's Revenge with Phaser? I believe he discusses this as well.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and I would also actually recommend. Did you ever read the Gilson?
Oh, Gilson. Yeah. From Aristotle to Darwin and back. Yes.
Yeah, and I forgot that the subtitle of it because I pulled it up here just to double check the title is A Journey in Final Causality, Species and Evolution.
That's a good
and I
one.
thought of that a lot earlier whenever you were talking about how some of this stuff just leaches in and stays there in the Western vocabulary. Like it's this Aristotelianism that's there, even though people don't want to admit that it's there operative. Yeah, and then probably some of the writings of Father Austracchio or however you say his name. You probably there was a volume I think Clooney did with him. It was him and Father James Brent and a couple of others as well. And
You're
then
talking about the priest from the Philippines.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, well, yeah, but he's in the Eastern Province.
Yeah,
of the Dominicans. I think he's up at Providence College. But Thomistic Evolution, that volume has some essays that are related to this more from a purely Thomist perspective. I still think that the essay by Maritain and what you said about the kind of elevating cause, I'm not familiar with the Proust lecture, but the idea of elevation of the causality, working through the secondary cause in evolution. Maritain struggles in the good sense that he's working through it in an essay that's in Untrammeled Approaches. It's got some of the quirkiness of him writing in his 80s. And he's just letting himself go. But it's a thought-provoking essay. I mean, I remember reading it some years ago. But yeah, I would say, especially, I think the Gilson text is actually very good because people do very well with those kind of narratives as well. Yeah. So like dealing with this, highly metaphysical issue, but seeing it kind of work through, the kind of historical genesis of some of these ideas. So
a couple others, obviously Rob Koons, I think anything he does on Neo-Aristotelian, William Simpson as well. Will often deal with these issues. And another guy who's not a theist philosopher, he's a philosopher of biology. I brought him up earlier, Dennis Walsh. He is an Aristotelian biologist. So check out their works. Those are just a few names to throw out there.
That's awesome. All right. So I have two more questions. I'm going to give this one to Dr. Meinert. I think we've already discussed, whether or not there's teleology anywhere else in the universe aside from biology. We talked about the laws of nature and powerism. So I think that's good. Dr. Meinert, how do you get from natural teleology to moral teleology? This is fascinating.
Sure. So why don't do you want to go be a little bit more explicit with your question, only because I need to know who I'm like, what presupposed version of this question am I answering?
Right? I mean, I guess suppose that I guess the audience that we're trying to appeal to is maybe someone who is more nominalist or thinks that they don't need to reference natural teleology. They can just maybe talk about the categorical imperative and reason.
Sure. So let's not necessarily, how to put this, directly address incorrectly formulated questions. I'm not saying your question is all wrong, but I'm thinking of like so much of the literature that's concerned about naturalism in whether the 20th century or post-Hume. I think that there are so many ways of approaching a problem that, because it's trying to answer the particular issues caused by a malformed question, kind of get you stuck. So I'm always struck, and I'm not a guy. I mean, I will complain and moan about Thomists who kind of do the same thing over and over again and repeat their texts through Aristotle. And I'm not a person who likes to do that, but I'm so struck by the down-to-earthness just on the level of, trying to tease out the phenomena of the question of agency that you see at the beginning of like the Nicomachean Ethics and Aristotle. And I think it's such a good way of seeing how natural teleology is stuck in here. And this is one of these things that eventually bit MacIntyre as he realized he had to take this stuff seriously. Updated, but it bit him. He thought like he didn't need to do this, and he realized you ask, okay, what is it that the human person is? Like, what is it that you do, right? And so you're kind of you're stepping back. Like, we want to watch ourselves and see what we're doing reflectively here. And you're asking, let me ask it in an idiom that is Aristotelian, and then let's imagine it, though, perhaps then mediated into a language that, someone can think of this, okay, I ask this without the jargon. But, Aristotle says, what are the powers, the activities of being human? Just sort of like general notions of like the fact that, I desire things and I get vexed at things, and I, have feelings of love. And of course I investigate into things. And so I have a kind of ability to know things. Like, I'm trying to be as general as possible, like at the level of common sense in the kind of pre-philosophical level of the phenomena. I will things, I form relations, etc. And as you start to just talk about this, you're really still functioning on what would be in the Aristotelian jargon as being speculative. You're just asking what is this thing that it is to be man? Now, your eye is moving toward moral agency, but you're still kind of asking a general question of what is it to be a human person, and to define that against other beings. And so just doing that in the most general of senses, you're functioning at the level of natural teleology. Right now, presupposing then that it is legitimate to kind of try to understand what it is to be human as opposed to not human. That back up. Let me say that again. To as long as we can say that kind of reasoning I was just doing is something that is teleologically structured, I'm functioning at the level of natural teleology. So, even if you were to say something as very general as, look, I have desires and I form bonds with other creatures, and they're of a particular kind, that some of which is I create those bonds, right? So I'm trying to very generally give human sociability a nexus here. I then say something like, whatever happens to be a legitimate bond, I'm not so much worried about fussing that out, but it would be wrong just for, a kind at the level of my common sense interacting with the world. It would be wrong for me to just break those bonds of sociability just for my own selfish pleasure. Now what the details of that look like, I don't know, blah, 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 blah. That turn that I just did there, though, is an example of going from speculative cognition to what, the scholastics at least will refer to as synderesis. I have just grasped the end of the virtue of temperance. Very nebulously, but I basically said that there's some sort of subordination of desires to the structure of my relationships with others, the higher virtues. So I'm kind of mediating this through the virtue of justice without saying it kind of directly. And hence reason has a kind of ruling of what makes for the proper use of human desire, for example. Right. So the kind of insight that one has, even you can be John Stuart Mill. I was just putting together lectures this summer for a political philosophy class. And you can say that perhaps society shouldn't do anything to the drunkard, but yeah, it's wrong what the drunkard's doing to himself. Just society's not going to do anything to him. But you see the way he's not living a full human life. I think even Mill is going to admit this quite openly. Well, what you're seeing there in the most broad sense is then a moral value that comes from the basis of just this general apprehension of what it is to be human, what it is to have, to have a certain act complex of various subordinated acts, but I've not quite articulated what they are yet, but I grasp all of a sudden one of the subordinations. And not only one of the subordinations, but how one of those subordinations of basically reason, relationality or justice, and my affect of desire, concupiscence, if you will, a concupiscible appetite, if you will, epithumedicon, if you want to be more Greek, I suppose. You're grasping what that means for my action, right? Like you've just made this first turn, as the later scholastics will say, toward the speculatively practical. You're no longer just merely in the speculative, but you've presupposed something about the way the world is, but you've seen what that means for your own agency. And now you're at least within the domain of talking in a moral vocabulary. And so this kind of shift happens all the time then. I mean, you could do this across various virtues, and then that becomes part of the warp and woof of articulating moral philosophy. But notice, and now this is something I'm quite insistent on, because I think sometimes I've had this fight with many atomists, actually. There's a real temptation to want to deduce that moral truth. That's the reason why I kind of tried to just come up with the example, to deduce it from some kind of teleology that's out there. And this is what people react to quite violently. And it's from a lack of seeing that there is a difference between purely speculative cognition, because you could go in the direction of Aristotle's De Anima or whatever from what we were just talking about. And you could distinguish the powers, and you could talk about sort of this metaphysical, quasi-metaphysical issue of the gradation of life in the human person and all of that, as though you would then deduce from that your morality. But it's more like this background screen of ideas that are here. And then it's just like everything else. Just like when you go from faith to theology or from science to natural philosophy, you here are going from whether it's natural philosophy of the soul or just common sense considering the soul, to then what does this mean for human agency, though? Because there's something in that experience that then tells them about the reality of what it is to be human. And so, Aristotle at the beginning of Nicomachean Ethics, just sort of, he does it really fast, but he's like, okay, well, what are the powers of the soul? Okay, here's the one that's the highest. So of course, what's human fulfillment going to be? It's going to be a kind of action, because it has to be action and not merely a state of the soul. And it's going to be a kind of action that's either that highest activity or activity in accord with that highest activity, right? Okay, fine. That's just a really fast version of it. His mind was much faster than ours. But so that's a way of trying to, maintain a single view that doesn't create two totally separate domains that have nothing to do with each other, in which freedom kind of has this absolute autonomy over top of the physical world. And then you can do a kind of argument on the side of this. I think it's a much more beautiful way of looking at reality, because then you're not seeing the external world as this malleable goo for human freedom, right? But rather instead you have a kind of unified view of kind of teleological structuring of all things. But that's more of a kind of meta issue. That would be a kind of Hanby issue. We were talking about what's his first name? Michael, right? Yeah, Michael Hanby. That would be a very Michael Hanby issue. But anyway, does that sort of answer you? Like, I'm trying to avoid, I'm trying to avoid merely the pat answer is all. But that move from speculative to synderesis is very important. And at once, you don't want to reduce it to the natural, but you need to see how, in the words of Father Michel Labradette, synderesis is a kind of derivative or second light. Like, it's derivative, but that doesn't mean that it's merely speculative. So
yeah, because I remember when I had Rob Coons on the channel, I was like, the first time, this was kind of like 2 years ago, I think, or even earlier, actually, maybe like when I was in my freshman year in college, and I was super excited. I said, so Rob, can you tell me how we deduce morality from our metaphysics, and we just get this nice one-for-one correspondence? And he kind of cautioned me, like, okay, Swan, like, I mean, it's not exactly as, let's say, I don't know, univocal as that, perhaps, but what was it, Dr. Meinert? Your approach kind of reminded me a little bit about maybe Philippa Foot's way of explaining, morality, because she talks about how, when we say something's bad, we maybe you presuppose a notion of harm, but then harm presupposes this notion of normativity or health or flourishing, right? And so before we get to Seth, do you think that's a fair summarization, or would you want to add anything else?
No, it's been a long while since I've read Philippa Foot. I had to interact with that stuff whenever I was in graduate school. I'm very allergic to spending time in any analytics, even ones who are decent. I apologize, Seth, because you're an Oxford person, so it's like, what in the world's wrong with me? But it's just, it's the snottiness of being a scholastic. But yeah, I think so, because it's I think that's at least fair to try if you're trying to give it to an audience that's going to that's perhaps a little bit less bought into the jargon of the school than I am. But I do remember at the time of having a virtue ethics class of finding, and that was right where I was coming to this insight from the school, actually, finding Foot to be amenable. So
yeah, Seth, do you have any
the stuff from McIntyre? Read the later McIntyre, where he realizes that he needs to take the kind of biology, so to speak, seriously, in the sense that you can't just, that he realized he was maybe being a little bit too Kantian or something like that. He was being a little bit too caught up in practical rationality questions without the kind of further ontological questions. But yeah, let Seth go.
Yeah, I'll be honest. The early and later McIntyre are who converted me to natural law ethics. Yeah. So that was actually my first introduction. It was a weird thing where I was reading on moral psychology, which sort of wrecked my view of morality. And this was a way of God's way of deconstructing me so he could reconstruct me in the truth. Because just by sheer coincidence, I picked up After Virtue after that. And then digested McIntyre and natural law theory just, religiously. And just sort of go off what you said, to give maybe a digestible version, that what ultimately convinced me was he gave this illustration in After Virtue of the fisherman. To know what a fisherman is to know what a fisherman ought to be. Fishermen ought to, have good hooks. They ought to have a fishing pole, ought to go out at the right times of day. A fisherman catches fish, right? Simply, very simply, that's the ultimate cause of which all these proximal final causes are derived from. It's to catch fish, right? So once you have that essence, once you have that you can have an ought. And so he takes that just real generally, just as a sort of basis for deriving an ought from an is. And then, of course, once you get into the biological reality, well, what does it mean to be a human being, right? We can then say have an is for what it is to be a human being, a real essence, right? And of course, I also would caution against a sort of simple deduction, right, as well. But just from a real simple way for people to sort of grasp it, if this is the first time they're encountering it, to know what a human being is to know what a human being ought to do, right? And that's what we mean by natural law, right? To know the nature of something is to know what it ought to do. To know what it is to know what a thing ought to do. And there are certain things human beings tend toward, and that's the sort of basic starting reason from which Aristotle and the later scholastics sort of jumped off from.
Yeah, the most helpful analogy for me came from I think Fazer and Oderberg both use this example, but he talks about, I think it was Oderberg in particular, he talked about how, let's say you're walking in the forest with your nephew and you see a triangle etched into a tree and you say, oh, that's a good triangle, right? And then, your nephew asks you, why is that a good triangle? And you explain like, well, it has, it's very, let's say, close to the triangular essence or nature. It has three sides, straight edges and maybe 180 degrees, and all that. And it's like, well, what's a triangle? And then you basically almost give the same answer. So the answer to the question, what is a good triangle and what is a triangle, you could almost basically use the same definition, although with different nuances in both cases. That's an analogy that I found really helpful. But here's my last question, and it's this. Are there any theistic implications to teleological realism? That's a broad question. I don't know if it's properly worded. You might have to add in more premises, but what do you think about that? Let me go to Seth and then we'll close with Matthew.
Yeah, so that's the $1 million question. That's because so far everything I've said, you might be wondering why I'm even in a theology department. I've barely brought up God, and that was actually my initial supervisor's question. It's like, why are you in the theology department? And so but it is because I do firmly believe that there is a sort of theistic implication from a teleological realist position. So how do we get there, right? Because there are competitive models on offer right now. The religious naturalists are a current trend that are trying to do this. They're atheists, but they're teleological realists. Another example, real popular, is Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel has become a teleological realist, but of course he maintains his atheism. Right. So why be a teleological realist? Well, it goes back to what I talked about a little bit with Aristotle before and with Thomas when I talked about these sort of higher order goods. Right. And to put this as simply as possible, because without delving into the metaphysics too deeply, in order to have a norm and call that good, if we're going to use the same term, for the good of, say, Seth Hart and the good of an apple, or an apple tree, I should say, the good of an apple tree. Why is the same term used, though analogically, why is that term appropriate in both circumstances? And there must be some sort of good, a goodness in itself, some sort of defining measure by which each are measured by, right? It's the goodness in itself. And this is Plato's reasoning. And in a sense, it's taken up somewhat in Aristotle. That's part of my argument. It's taken somewhat in Aristotle, though in a very different form. And then again in Thomas, is that you need a sort of measure of the goodness itself. You need something that is goodness intrinsically, that it just simply is good, the good by which each thing is measured Thus, a theistic system, because God is the good within the Thomistic, Platonic, or Aristotelian system, God is the good. Well, not Aristotelian. I should pull back a bit from that. God is the good in those systems. Therefore, God is the sort of metric, the measure by which these sort of measurements are being made. The analogy I commonly use, and this is the as quick as I can, the easiest I can give it, is in order to have different measures by which we say something is longer or shorter, we need something objective by which those are being measured by, which is space or measure itself. There needs to be some way of saying if something is longer or shorter, then we need some objective system by which those measurements are being made. In the same way, if something is better or worse than something, making these normative claims, there needs to be a measure by which it is done. And now it's easy enough to just to say, well, it's the substance of the creatures being measured against, the powers or the things intrinsic to the system itself. But that gets a bit dicey when whenever you start measuring the goodness of things between two different substances, right? How can you use the same term in those circumstances? And that's why I think you need a sort of goodness in itself, that measure in itself. So that's the easiest illustration I've come up with. You'll have to let me know if that works.
Well,
I'm sorry, because I did not expect you to go fourth way logic.
Yeah,
it makes sense. It makes total sense. I'm sorry. Go, please, Soren. It's your show.
No, I was going to mention, that's the fourth way, right? Or
absolutely. There's a reason. So this is actually part of my thesis. There is a reason the fourth way precedes the fifth way. Mm-hmm. And this is a bit of my own unique thought, right? But I think it is because the fifth way presupposes the conclusions of the fourth way. I do not think the fourth way or the fifth way stands on its own. I think the fifth way shows, you could reason it the other way. If once you get the fourth way, the fifth way follows, or once you show teleological realism, you show the fourth way. But I think that there's a reason these are sort of bunched together, I think, in Thomas's imagination.
Yeah, Matthew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think that just sort of more of an inter-Thomistic thing. I think that helps to prevent, there's some bad analogies he uses in that fifth way, actually, because he kind of reduces created causality into something that's too instrumental. So that's actually good to see. That fleshes out the details of the argument. But
can I throw something? Yeah. So the reason I come to this as well is whenever we get into some of his other arguments in Summa contra Gentiles and various other places in his writing, I think you're 100% right. It seems too instrumental until you actually compare it across how, especially that era analogy, which he uses a dozen different times. Mm-hmm. Once you see it across the entire, corpus Thomisticum, you begin to make sense that there's this normative component to it. And I actually think that's something Phaser misses in his analysis of final causation, because I think the analogy he gave is, if efficient causation, if A causes B, final causation is B causes A, right? He sort of inverts it, but you're missing that normative component, which I think is sort of intrinsic to the logic of Thomas. And that's why I think, so I'm really big on fourth way stuff. So anyway.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's great. As soon as you started doing it, I was like, that's good. The poor fourth way. There's enough of a Platonist in me. And the more time I spend as a Byzantine Catholic, it's the more Platonist and Neoplatonist you become. I'll just say, because you were saying, it's sort of the line of Plato. And then, Aristotle goes in his own way. One of the things that always has struck me from the sort of Aristotelian teleological world is, the first cause, especially in the metaphysics, is, it's people who've read the corpus. I'm not saying anything that's new when I say this. So people have said this before me. But the causality that's exercised by pure act is a kind of, teleological desire of all things, kind of up the hierarchies of goods, right? That things are desiring not only their own goods, but the goods of their species, and then also too the good of the whole. And it's the imitation, the closest thing you can get to the causal effects. And even people like Garrigou-Lagrange, openly say this. Aristotle's not good on efficient causality of creation and the first cause. It's not, the Thomists who read that into him, are giving him a little bit too much credit, is at least what, my tribe of Thomists say. But clearly, if nothing else, no matter how you read him, the whole world is, in its, we won't call it eternal, but its continued existence, in both directions temporally, is sort of striving to the degree that it can to imitate the perfection of the first cause. Well, if you suitably then deal with that bit of metaphysics, you start to look at the whole of reality as being charged with a kind of eros that imitates the eros of God. And it's just it's also just a beautiful natural theology. Beauty is not a mark of how to argue, but it's, extrinsic verification. It's, it's an argument from fittingness on behalf of this. And so, one of the theistic implications is to see how the everything is made with the omne agens agit sibi simile, that everything makes something like unto itself. Well, part of that likeness that that all agency has received is to be a kind of reflection of the degree of willing and love that can be attributed to the first cause. And that's part of the reflection that we all are of the first cause. And I mean, so to see not merely a question of finite goods and normativity here, right, but to see in a sense a kind of transcendental characteristic of love across agency in all beings is also striking as well. But that's more like just sort of go off the side, because you kind of dealt with the main theistic implication
Yeah,
there.
I would 100% agree with that as well.
Yeah. So anyway.
Swan, do you know Mary George by chance?
Sounds familiar.
So if you're looking for someone who's I think dealt with the normative issue of final causation, the good implicit within that, I think Mary George, he responds to Ed Feser, I think in Philosophia Christi. Check out that article.
Marie, it's Marie George.
Thank you. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's fine. No, that's fine.
Well, gentlemen, I had a great time having you on my show, man. And it's funny, like sometimes like when we discuss classical theism, it takes me a minute to process everything. This time, because this is like what I've studied and what I love and enjoy reading about. I was like, yeah, okay, yeah, everything followed in track. So yeah, you guys did a wonderful job, and I had such a great time listening. Seth, I wish you well in your PhD pursuits, and Dr. Meinert, let's see, are you translating more works, or what are you up to now?
Well, yeah, there are some things that are in the offing. I mean, I'm in the midst of trying to finish edits on things. But De Revelatione on Divine Revelation, I'm getting my copies in like 2 weeks. So big Garrigou is coming out on apologetics. So,
well, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on to my show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.